Hey there! Tonight, we're heading out, not to the saloons or showdowns, but to the edges of memory, where hunger was a daily companion and comfort was measured in what you could chew. We're talking about the real Wild West. Not legends or outlaws, but ordinary folks who crossed dry land and long miles, who counted themselves lucky if supper meant beans and bread, and luckier still if there was a scrap of jerky in their pocket or a piece of candy stashed for a hard day. No glory, no gold-just dust, distance, and the hope tucked into a biscuit or a handful of dried apples. If this kind of gentle, slow history helps you unwind, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if it brings you that quiet kind of comfort. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what snack you reach for when the world feels a little too big. It's always strangely comforting to know who's out there, sharing this story. So dim the lights, settle in, maybe find something sweet or salty if you have it. Out here, where the prairie wind rattles the walls and the cupboard's never quite full, sometimes a bite of candy or a crust of bread is more than a treat. It's a reason to keep going. Sometimes it's everything. You wouldn't find it on a map, even if you had one, which most folks didn't. The land just folds and unfolds, a patchwork of dust and stubborn grasses, a horizon that keeps its secrets beneath the hot, humming sky. This isn't the West of painted legends. This is the last edge of something. A place where the world ends not with mountains or rivers or a line drawn in ink, but where hunger begins to whisper and the taste of anything sweet can feel like a miracle. You step out of the wagon, boots sinking into a crust of sun-baked mud, the air sharp with alkali and old smoke. The wind never quite lets up, always carrying grit that settles in your teeth and makes every meal taste faintly of the land itself. You notice right away how folks keep food close jerky tied at the belt. A pouch of dried apples, a sliver of rock candy wrapped in paper and stowed in the pocket for a day when hope runs low. There's no single shape to the world here. The prairie stretches further than you can see. Buttes rise like old bones, and sometimes a river cuts the land into something almost gentle. The sky is so wide it makes you feel smaller than hunger. Rain may not come for months, but when it does, it's all at once, turning the dust to rivers, making the world smell new for a few days until the sun dries it back to memory. The air is filled with the scent of sage and frying grease, the promise of coffee if you're lucky, and always that undercurrent of sweat and old leather. Most days begin and end with the weather. There are no clocks. Time is measured by the slant of the sun, the taste of dryness in your mouth, the ache in your legs after a day spent hunting something water, shelter, a bite of something that isn't just calories, but comfort. You wake when the sky shifts from black to bruised to blue, and if you're lucky, there's a biscuit left from yesterday or a strip of jerky still soft enough to chew. If not, you make do maybe a handful of parched corn, maybe nothing at all until the next town. Out here the land is a kind of hunger. It's not just what you eat, but what you dream about. The ground doesn't give easily. Crops fail more often than they thrive. The best you can hope for is a patch of beans or corn, a few chickens scratching in the dust behind the house, a cow that hasn't wandered off or gone dry. The kitchen is a room built around a stove, but most of the real cooking happens over open flame, outside, where the wind steals your heat and the smoke stings your eyes. If you close your eyes, you can hear the sizzle of salt pork in a pan, the hiss of coffee boiling over, the faint sweet crunch of hardtack as it breaks between your teeth. The houses themselves lean into the wind, patched together from boards and hope, their roofs held down with rocks or whatever could be found. The walls let in the cold in winter and the heat in summer. Inside it smells of old grease, dried herbs and the faint tang of molasses, if you're lucky enough to have any left to stretch into candy for the children. The floor is swept dirt, sometimes covered with rushes, more often just left to harden beneath boots and spilled coffee. Food here isn't just a meal, it's a daily problem that has to be solved and resolved. There are no pantries lined with jars, no easy abundance. What you eat depends on the season, the weather, and the luck of the last supply wagon. You might have a sack of beans, a bucket of lard, a jar of pickled eggs, a tin of baking powder, and a handful of dried fruit. Sugar is precious measured out, hoarded, hidden for special occasions or the promise of a guest. Coffee is gold. Sweets are rare enough to be remembered years later. The world outside is a constant reminder of how little separates comfort from want. In spring, the ground might give up wild onions, the promise of green after months of brown and grey. Summer brings berries, if the birds haven't beaten you to them, and sometimes a rabbit snared by luck more than skill. Autumn is the season of harvest. If there's anything to gather, corn roasted on the fire, apples sliced and left to dry on a stretched sheet. A promise against the hunger waiting in winter. Winter is a time for stretching bread baked hard to last, beans boiled until they lose their shape, the last of the jerky chewed slow by lamplight while the wind rattles the shutters. You measure distance by what you can carry. On the trail, food is what fits in a pocket or saddlebag jerky for strength, dried apples for sweetness, hardtack for stubbornness. Some carry a lump of molasses candy wrapped in a square of cloth, rationed out in tiny bites to make it last. Others keep a pouch of parched corn, a handful of nuts, whatever keeps hunger at bay during a long day's ride. The lucky ones might find a peddler selling lemon drops or horehound, a taste of something bright enough to cut through the dust. In town, the general store is the heart of craving. Barrels of crackers, jars of penny candy, slabs of cheese sweating in the heat, tins of sardines or peaches if the last shipment made it through. Children press their noses to the glass, counting coins and hopes, weighing the joy of a single sweet against the long walk home. Adults linger by the counter, sipping weak coffee, savouring a bite of whatever is new or rare, a slice of cake brought in by a neighbour, a pickled egg from the jar, a cup of sarsaparilla fizzing with the taste of something almost modern. The landscape itself shapes your cravings. Dry days make you dream of fresh oranges, the sharp bite of lemon, the impossible promise of ice. Rainy days bring the memory of hot biscuits, butter melting into the crumb, the taste of honey if you're fortunate enough to have neighbours with bees. The wind carries the smell of someone frying dough, the kind of scent that makes you remember every festival, every fair, every day when food was more than just fuel. There are no feasts here, not often. Most meals are quick, practical, meant to fill the hollow more than the heart. But sometimes, when the weather is kind and the larder is not yet empty, there are moments of celebration: cornbread baked golden, beans stewed with a bit of bacon, cake sweetened with the last spoonful of sugar, cookies crisped on a tin plate set near the fire. On Sundays, if fortune smiles, there's coffee with real cream, biscuits with a streak of jam, and the laughter of children who for a moment forget the taste of want. Out beyond the edge of town, the land is less forgiving. Homesteads crouch beneath the sky, cabins built from logs or sod, every board a testament to someone's hope. The wind never stops, and the silence is sometimes broken only by the crack of a twig or the distant howl of a coyote. Food here is what you can grow, trap, or trade for. Every scrap is precious. A pot of beans simmering all day, a rabbit stewed with wild onions, a loaf of bread baked from flour that was once meant to last the winter. These are the feasts of the frontier. Travellers and cowboys know hunger intimately. On cattle drives, meals are what the chuck wagon can provide. Beans, salt pork, sourdough biscuits, coffee boiled black and thick as mud. Jerky is chewed through dust storms, dried apples eaten beneath stars, rock candy shared around the fire as a reminder that sweetness still exists. The trail is long, and the appetite is a companion as loyal as any horse. Everywhere, people find ways to cheat hunger, to turn scarcity into satisfaction. Fry bread made from flour, water, and a bit of fat, fried in a cast-iron pan over open flame. Parched corn roasted until it pops, sweetened if there's a pinch of sugar to spare. Biscuits baked hard to last the journey, crumbled into coffee or eaten dry, each bite a stubborn refusal to let the land win. Food is a kind of language here, a way to share, to comfort, to remember. Neighbours trade jars of pickles for a slice of pie, children swap candy for marbles, men share coffee around the morning fire, each cup a small act of hope. Stories gather around the table, carried in the smoke and the laughter, the memory of better days and the promise of more to come. The world ends where the land gives way to hunger, where the sky presses down and the road disappears into heat and dust. But even here, people find ways to fill the emptiness, with a bite of jerky, a piece of dried apple, a square of candy that tastes for a moment like a miracle. You may not know what tomorrow will bring, but tonight there's enough to chew, enough to share, enough to keep hope alive. And as the sun sets, painting the land in gold and shadow, you sit by the fire, the taste of salt and smoke lingering on your tongue. The world is quiet, the wind. You wouldn't call it a house, not really. Not in the way you'd describe the painted homes back east, with their glass windows and their tidy porches and their walls that keep out the world. Out here, home is a compromise between what you need and what the land is willing to give. Some are built of cut boards, others of mud brick, sod, or logs thick as your arm, each one patched and repatched as the seasons pass. The roof is whatever you could haul, shingles if you had money, tar paper if you didn't, sometimes just canvas stretched tight and weighted down with stones. When the wind rises, everything shivers. The walls lean a little more each year, but they hold together, and so do you. The smell, when you open the door, is always a mix. Coffee boiled black, biscuits gone stale, wood smoke and bacon grease, a trace of molasses if you're lucky. In winter, the air is sharp with cold and the faint animal warmth of bodies yours, your family's, sometimes a dog or a goat curled in the corner, all sharing the same breath. In summer, dust and sweat and the faint sweetness of wildflowers drift in through the cracks. You get used to it, the way you get used to the wind, or the ache in your back, or the knowledge that sometimes supper is just going to be beans again. The kitchen isn't a room or a corner near the stove. The stove itself is the heart of the house, iron-bellied and temperamental, its door always a little crooked, its surface scarred by years of boiling, baking, frying and waiting. If you're lucky, you have a table near the window, battered by time and small elbows, with benches that creak and a chair that always seems to be missing a slat. The floor is swept dirt, sometimes covered in a scatter of straw or the crumbs of last night's cornbread. If you're really lucky, there's a rag rug, braided from old shirts and the remains of worn-out dresses, colours faded by sun and soap. Every house has its own rhythm. You wake with the light, sometimes before, when the stove needs coaxing back to life and the coffee needs to start boiling if anyone's going to have the strength for the day ahead. There's always someone moving, fetching water, feeding chickens, slicing bread, or scraping the bottom of the lard tin for enough grease to fry a little dough. The first meal is what you have. Maybe a heel of bread, maybe yesterday's biscuits split and toasted over the fire, maybe just coffee if the flour barrel is running low. If there's sugar, it's measured out in careful pinches. If there's bacon, it's cut thin and cooked slow, the grease poured off and saved for the next meal or the one after that. The kitchen is where small miracles happen. Sometimes it's just enough food to go around, sometimes it's the surprise of a treat, a spoonful of molasses stirred into hot water and called candy, a rare orange split between 3 children, a handful of dried apples you thought were gone until you found them at the back of a shelf. Sweets are almost never planned, they're found, bartered or made from scraps. If you're lucky, a peddler comes through with a sack of lemon drops or rock candy, each piece precious as gold. More often you make do, a bannock of fried dough dusted with sugar if you have any, or just a drizzle of honey if you're truly blessed. Children learn early that treats are rare and never wasted. They cluster around the stove when there's candy in the house, eyes wide, hands sticky if they're lucky enough to get a piece. Sometimes, if you're feeling generous, you give them the last bite of something sweet before bed, watching as they eat slow, trying to make the flavour last until morning. The memory of a treat can linger longer than the taste. You carry it with you out to the barn, into the field, through the endless repetition of chores. Every meal is a negotiation with the pantry. There's no larder lined with jars, no shelves heavy with preserves. What you have is what you put up, what you traded for, what you managed to stretch from one season to the next. Beans and corn, sacks of flour and meal, a crock of lard, a jar of pickled eggs, a dwindling wedge of cheese. Sometimes there's a pot of beans that's lasted all week, each day a little thinner, each night a little saltier, but still something to fill the hollow. On Sundays, maybe there's something special. Fried chicken if the hens have been laying, or a pie if the orchard was kind and you were able to save a little sugar. Biscuits are a staple, not the soft towering kind you see in picture books, but flat rounds, baked hard to last through the week, eaten plain or split and filled with whatever's left from supper. Cornbread is another constant, crumbly and sweet if there's molasses, dry and plain if there's not. Fry bread is a celebration flour, water, a bit of fat, fried in a pan until golden and crisp. The smell is enough to draw everyone inside, even the dog who waits hopefully for scraps. Treats are not always sweet. A slice of salt pork fried up crisp, a bit of cheese with a heel of bread, a boiled egg sprinkled with salt. These can feel like feasts when hunger is always just a day away. If there's a garden, you might have fresh tomatoes in summer, green onions in spring, maybe a handful of beans or a few ears of corn to roast over the fire. In winter, it's more likely to be dried beans, pickled beets, or potatoes stored in the root cellar, their skins wrinkled but still good for boiling. Sometimes when the world is kind, you make candy. Not the store-bought kind, but what you can manage with what you have. Molasses pulled into ropes and snipped into pieces, popcorn balls stuck together with syrup, brittle made from whatever nuts you could find or trade for. If you have milk and sugar, you might try fudge, but more often it's just boiled syrup poured onto snow or beaten until it hardens. The children watch, eyes bright, waiting for the moment when it's cool enough to touch. Sundays, holidays, and special occasions are marked by what's on the table. Maybe a cake baked in a cast-iron pan and sweetened with whatever you could spare. Maybe a pie, the crust tough but the filling bright with apples or dried peaches, each slice cut thin to make it last. On the 4th of July or at a barn dance there might be lemonade, cold and sharp, or cookies passed from hand to hand, each one a small reminder that the world can be generous now and then. Food is never just food. It's a way of showing love, of marking time, of making something out of nothing. A mother saves the last spoonful of jam for a child's fever. A father gives up his biscuit so the youngest can have seconds. Neighbours trade eggs for sugar, beans for coffee, a jar of pickles for a story or a bit of help with the roof. Every bite is a negotiation, every treat a small victory over the land, the weather and the endless sameness of days. At night, when the lamps are turned down and the house is quiet, the kitchen is still. The stove cools, the pans are stacked, and the last crumbs are brushed from the table into a waiting hand or a hopeful mouth. Sometimes there's a secret treat kept back for just this moment, a bit of brittle, a dried apple, the last piece of candy from a sack that's lasted all month. It's eaten slowly, savoured, the taste lingering long after the sweetness is gone. The house itself settles into the dark, creaking as the wind shifts, as the temperature drops, as the animals sigh and settle into their corners. The smells change, wood smoke and cooling bread, the faint tang of pickles, the ghost of fried onions. You listen to the quiet, the soft breathing of family, the distant bark of a dog, the steady, rhythmic tick of time passing. There's comfort in the repetition, in the familiar aches and the daily routines, in the knowledge that tomorrow will bring more work, more hunger, but also, perhaps, another small sweetness. You might not have much, but you have enough a roof that mostly keeps out the rain, a stove that mostly keeps you warm, and the memory of a treat that was shared, not hoarded, when the night felt especially long. Out here, where the world narrows to the size of your table and the reach of your lantern, the smallest joys are the ones that last the longest. The taste of something sweet, the warmth of bread fresh from the oven, the laughter of children sticky with syrup. These are the treasures you carry, even when the cupboards are nearly bare. And so, you endure. You patch the roof, stretch the flour, trade what you can, and hope for the best. You measure out sugar by the spoonful, save the last piece of candy for a rainy day, and teach your children that treats are rare but hope is free. The house leans, the wind howls, the cupboards empty and fill again. But the kitchen is always the heart-warm, welcoming, and always. You wouldn't find it on a railroad schedule, this place. It's a town mostly held together by wind, habit, and the hope that something good might arrive with the next wagon. Main Street is more a promise than a plan, a single stubborn strip of dirt, lined with buildings that lean into each other like tired friends. When the sun is high, dust curls up from every step, and when it rains, the whole world turns to mud, thick and clinging as old worries. If you want to find the heart of town, follow the smells. There's wood smoke from the blacksmith, old hay from the livery, stale beer and fresh bread from the saloon, and, if you're lucky, a sweet faint tang drifting from the general store. That's where you'll find the real treasures. Not gold, not silver, but the taste of something rare, something sweet or salty, something that lets you forget the day for a minute. The general store isn't just a shop. It's the town's memory and its wishful thinking, all stacked on crooked shelves and in dusty barrels. The bell over the door rings no matter how gently you push, and the floorboards creak in the same places they always have. There's a counter worn smooth by elbows and years, a glass jar filled with lemon drops and jawbreakers, a barrel of hardtack biscuits, a crate of rock candy wrapped in crinkled paper. Behind the counter, the shopkeeper knows every family by name, every secret by rumour, and every child's greatest wish. Usually a penny for candy, sometimes a whole nickel for a bottle of sarsaparilla. On quiet afternoons, townsfolk drift through just to see what's new or what isn't. There might be a crate of oranges gone soft at the edges, or a tin of sardines from some distant coast. There are barrels of crackers, bins of dried beans, slabs of bacon hanging from the rafters, and, in the right season, a stack of ginger snaps or molasses cookies that taste of home and far away all at once. Children cluster around the candy jars, faces pressed to the glass, breath fogging the view of lemon drops, licorice whips, fireballs, and horehound sticks. A single coin can buy a handful of sweetness, carefully counted out, each piece a tiny celebration. The bravest try to sneak an extra, but the shopkeeper always notices. Only one now, she says, with a wink that means sometimes she forgets to count on purpose. For the grown-ups, the treats are subtler. A wedge of cheese, a fresh loaf if the baker's feeling generous, a cup of coffee brewed thick and muddy, meant to be sipped slow while the world goes by. Sometimes there's gossip to trade for a slice of pie news from up the trail, a letter from a son gone to California, the rumour of a travelling peddler with strange candies never seen before. The store is a crossroads. Cowboys fresh off the range come in with dust in their hair and hunger in their eyes, trading stories for jerky and a tin of beans. Miners with pockets full of fool's gold buy a slab of salted pork or a cigar, chewing as they talk about the strike that's sure to come tomorrow. Farmers swap eggs for flour, milk for sugar, a basket of apples for a bag of coffee. It's not just the store either. The street outside is lined with possibility vendors with roasted peanuts in paper sacks, a boy selling lemonade when the sun burns high, a woman with a tray of fried pies, the crust still warm from the skillet. In the evenings, if there's music in the saloon and something worth celebrating, the street comes alive with laughter, boots stomping dust and the smell of popcorn drifting on the breeze. Food is currency here, as real as any coin. You might trade a dozen eggs for a jar of molasses, or a pound of dried beans for a handful of peppermints. A child might run errands all week for a single stick of candy, unwrapped and savoured in secret. Sometimes what's traded isn't even food, a story for a slice of pie, a promise to mend a fence for a piece of cake, a secret shared over a cup of coffee and a plate of cookies. Scarcity makes every snack brighter. Sugar is precious, salt is gold, and coffee is a kind of faith, the hope that tomorrow will taste a little sweeter than today. When a new shipment comes in, the whole town feels it. The bell rings more often, the shelves are picked clean of anything sweet, and for a few days everyone walks with a little more purpose, a little more hope in their step. Not everyone can buy what they want. Credit is given and grudges are kept. The shopkeeper keeps a ledger behind the counter, names written in careful lines, debts measured in flour, sugar and beans. Sometimes a family goes without, waiting for the next harvest, the next paycheck, the next miracle. In those times, a neighbour might buy a little extra, slip it quietly to the mother with too many mouths to feed and not enough coins to count. There are rituals here. Saturday means a fresh supply of biscuits. Sunday, if the preacher's in town, there might be cookies passed out after church. Children lined up with shining eyes and sticky hands. The first hot day of summer brings lemonade stands. The first frost, mugs of hot cider spiced with whatever someone could spare. Every snack has its season, its story, its place in the slow rhythm of the town. Treats are carefully rationed, never wasted. A lemon drop is sucked until it's gone. A stick of licorice is nibbled in secret. A cookie is split 3 ways and savoured crumb by crumb. Even the wrappers are saved, smoothed out, folded, sometimes used again to wrap a new dream. The saloon has its own menu of snacks, meant to keep patrons thirsty and spending. Pickled eggs float in cloudy jars. Bowls of salted peanuts and pretzels sit on tables, free for the taking. Sometimes the bartender fries up bacon scraps or offers a plate of fried potatoes, hot and greasy, perfect with another drink. These treats are a lure, a comfort, and sometimes the only thing standing between a man and the memory he's trying to forget. Holidays and fairs turn the street into a celebration of food. There are popcorn balls, candy apples, fried dough dusted with sugar, and pies baked with whatever fruit managed to survive the summer. For a night, hunger feels far away, and the world is full of music, laughter, and the smell of something sweet. But most days, snacks are a quiet thing, a private comfort, a small rebellion against the sameness of beans and bread. A woman might keep a stash of hard candy wrapped in a handkerchief, hidden from children and neighbours alike. A man might treat himself to a cigar and a strip of jerky, chewing slow as he watches the sun set behind the livery. Children invent games to win a sweet, trading marbles, buttons, and stories in the schoolyard. Each prize a reminder that joy can be found, even in small things. The general store is where new things arrive. A fresh barrel of crackers, a new flavour of taffy, a bottle of sarsaparilla from a town you've only heard about in stories. Each new treat is an adventure, a way to taste the world beyond the horizon. Some things disappoint, a candy that's mostly sugar and air, a cake that's gone stale before you can buy it. But sometimes, a new snack becomes a legend, remembered in stories and craved for years after it's gone. Not all snacks are bought. Some are grown, gathered, or made at home, popcorn dried and popped in a skillet, dough fried in bacon fat and dusted with sugar, apples picked in secret from a neighbour's tree, dried and tucked away for winter. In hard times, a treat might be nothing more than a spoonful of molasses stirred into hot water, a biscuit saved from supper, or a handful of roasted corn. The store is also a place for dreams. Children press their faces to the glass and imagine what they'll buy when they're grown. Adults linger over displays, remembering the candies of their own childhood, the taste of a treat long gone. Even the old, who've lost their taste for sweets, Come in to watch the young and remember a time when a single lemon drop could change the colour of a whole day. As dusk falls, the town grows quiet. The store closes its doors, the windows glow with lamplight, and the last crumbs of the day are swept from the counter into a waiting hand. Out on Main Street the dust settles, and the smell of bread and sugar lingers in the air, a promise that tomorrow will come, and with it the hope of something sweet. The town is small, but it is enough. It has gossip and laughter and hunger and fleeting joys. It has the rhythm of boots on dirt, the turning of seasons, and the quiet pride of surviving another day. Sometimes you dream of seeing what's beyond the next hill, but most days you just hope the jar of lemon drops will last until the next wagon arrives. And so you endure, you trade, you barter, you hope, you save the last piece of candy for a rainy day. You could hear the piano before you saw the light, thin, bright notes tumbling out into the dust, mixing with laughter, boots on boards, and the low, steady hum of voices. The saloon was always there, right at the heart of town, its doors swinging with every story that came in from the road. It wasn't just a place for whiskey or cards, but for the kind of hunger that lingered even when your belly was full. The hunger for salt, for sweetness, for company, for something that tasted like more than survival. Inside, the air was thick with wood smoke, spilled beer, and the sharp, briny tang of pickled eggs floating in a cloudy jar behind the bar. There were bowls of roasted peanuts, sometimes fresh, sometimes gone a little stale, set out on battered tables, free for the taking, a trick to keep you drinking. Pretzels and hardtack, salty and tough, waited in crocks by the counter, their edges softened by the damp. Sometimes, if the barkeep was feeling generous or wanted to keep you there a little longer, he'd fry up scraps of bacon or a pan of potatoes hot and crisp, the kind of thing that made you order another round just to make the flavour last. Some came for the whiskey, some for the music, but everyone came for the company. The saloon was a crossroads, cowboys off the trail, miners with dust in every seam, railroaders, gamblers, farmers, women with sharp eyes and quicker wit. Stories poured across the tables as easily as the drinks who'd struck silver, who'd lost a horse, who'd seen a coyote out by the creek, who was sweet on the new schoolteacher. And always there was food to mark the telling. A handful of nuts tossed into a mouth to buy time, a slice of bread passed across the table, a pickled egg split in half and shared with someone who'd lost more than he cared to say. You'd see the children outside pressing their faces to the window, watching the grown-ups laugh and shout and eat. Sometimes, if luck was with them and the barkeep was kind, they'd get a treat, a lemon drop or a twist of licorice from the jar, a leftover fry bread or a penny's worth of roasted corn. Enough to make them feel part of the world inside, even if just for a minute. The saloon was only the beginning. Out on the main street, especially when the weather was kind or there was reason to celebrate, the world bloomed with colour and scent. Fairs came like a promise, rare and sudden, sweeping the town up in banners, laughter, and the smell of frying dough. You'd know a fair was coming by the way people walked heads a little higher, hands in pockets feeling for coins, children whispering about what they'd buy if luck or kindness went their way. The air at a fair was thick with sugar and smoke. There were stands where women sold popcorn balls, sticky and sweet, wrapped in wax paper and tied with string. Fried pies, apple, peach, sometimes nothing more than jam and hope folded into pastry were handed out on napkins, eaten hot enough to burn your tongue if you weren't careful. Lemonade stands sprouted like wildflowers, the girls behind them smiling brighter than the sun, the drink cold and sharp cutting through the dust and heat. Vendors walked the crowd, their voices rising above the music and the noise. Hot nuts, fresh fudge, taffy, pulled soft. They carried trays of candied apples, their red shells glossy and hard, each bite a crackle of sugar and tartness. Sometimes you'd find a man with a little cart, roasting chestnuts or peanuts over a tiny fire, the smell drawing a line of hungry children and tired mothers. Someone else would be selling tamales, hot and wrapped in corn husks, the flavours borrowed from 100 miles south and made new with every hand that touched them. The fair was where you tasted things you'd never tasted before or might never taste again. Maybe a slice of watermelon cold from a well. Maybe a piece of cake baked by a neighbour who'd saved her sugar for weeks. Maybe a bottle of sarsaparilla, cold and fizzy, tasting of roots and promises. Every bite was a memory in the making, a moment set aside from the sameness of ordinary days. Street food was its own kind of currency. On regular days you might see a boy with a basket of boiled peanuts, a woman frying dough in a pan set over coals, a peddler selling rock candy or honey sticks from a battered tin. People bartered for these snacks an egg for a handful of popcorn, a turn at the well for a piece of pie, a story told well for a sweet shared on a porch at dusk. On Sundays, after church, groups gathered near the steps, passing cookies and cider, sharing the news of the week along with the last crumbs from the plate. Not every snack was bought. Some were made at home, carried out wrapped in cloth or tucked into a pocket. A wedge of cornbread, a bit of dried apple, a hard candy saved for later. Children traded bites, invented games where the winner took the last peanut or the biggest piece. Sometimes a mother would save the last spoonful of molasses for a rainy day, turning it into taffy for a child whose shoes had worn through. Even in the lean times, there was food to be found if you knew where to look. Roasted acorns, parched corn, wild berries picked at the edge of town, all could be turned into something sweet, something to chew when the world felt thin. And when the crops failed or the wagons were late, people shared what they had. A biscuit broken in half, a cookie split 3 ways, a jar of pickled eggs passed down the row at a barn dance. Celebration and scarcity walked hand in hand. The rarest treats, fresh oranges, peppermint sticks, a little chocolate were passed around with ceremony, each bite a reminder of how far things had come or how far there was still to go. At fairs and dances, you ate not just to fill your belly, but to mark the occasion, to say, "Here we are together, and for tonight at least there is enough." Night fell slow and golden, the lights of the saloon and the fair flickering against the dark. Music drifted down the street, laughter echoed off the walls, and the smells of sugar and salt and frying fat lingered in the air. People wandered home with tired feet and full hands, pockets sticky with candy, faces flushed with the memory of a night that tasted brighter than most. Sometimes you dreamed of other places of cities where the streets were lined with shops, where ice cream was sold on every corner, where chocolate came in boxes instead of just stories. But most nights you were content with what you had. The last bite of pie, the warmth of a crowd, the taste of something sweet after a long day. The West was hard, but it had its moments, and sometimes a handful of peanuts or a penny's worth of fudge was enough to remind you why you stayed. The fair packed up in the night, the banners pulled down, the vendors gone before dawn. The saloon doors swung closed, the music faded, the streets swept clean. But the memory of treats and laughter lingered, a sweetness that carried you through the days when the world felt empty and the cupboards bare. The town was small, but it was enough. It had music and gossip and hunger and fleeting joys. It had the rhythm of boots on dust, the turning of seasons and the quiet pride of surviving another day. Sometimes you dreamed of tasting what lay beyond the horizon, but most nights you just hoped there'd be a little sugar left for tomorrow. And so you waited for the next celebration, the next fair, the next chance to taste something new. You saved your pennies, you shared your stories, and you held on to the hope that sweetness like laughter would find its way back, just when you needed it most. You wouldn't find your way by compass out here. The world is too wide, the tracks too many and too faint. The only map you carry is in what you remember. A bend in the river, a stand of cottonwoods, the way the ground turns sandy just before the next waterhole. Out here, the world ends not with a fence or a wall, but with the slow fade of wagon ruts into grass, the sky pulling everything apart until you aren't sure what's memory and what's hope. Most days you travel by hunger as much as by sun. You wake before dawn, the stars still bright overhead, and you listen. The creak of leather, the low murmur of voices, the soft thud of boots in dust. The air smells of horses, wood smoke, and yesterday's coffee grounds. You feel the ache in your legs, the dryness on your tongue, and you reach for what passes for breakfast, a strip of jerky, hard as old boot leather, or maybe a biscuit saved from the night before, crumbling and dry, but still a comfort. Sometimes, if you're lucky, there's a chunk of dried apple, sweet and tart, a memory of orchards far behind you. You chew slow, making it last, letting the taste linger as the day begins. The trail is routine and risk, both at once. You ride or walk or sit on the bouncing boards of a wagon, dust in your teeth and the sun at your back. The land stretches out flat as a thought you haven't finished yet. You measure distance not in miles, but in what you have left to eat. Every pocket and pouch is a larder, jerky, hardtack, parched corn, a handful of dried beans, maybe a sliver of rock candy wrapped in paper and hidden for a day when nothing else will do. Food on the trail is always a calculation. What will last? What will fill you up? What can you eat with one hand, reins in the other, and no hope of a fire until sundown? Jerky is everywhere. Beef, buffalo, sometimes even jackrabbit, smoked and salted until it's more memory than meat. You chew it until your jaw aches, until the salt stings your tongue and you have to swallow hard to get it down. It isn't a treat, but it's steady, and on the worst days, that's enough. If you're lucky, you might have pemmican fat and dried meat pounded together with berries, a recipe borrowed and learned from native hands. It tastes of smoke and something wild, and it will keep you moving when everything else gives out. Dried apples and peaches cut thin and left in the sun are a treasure, a bite of sweetness after hours of dust. Parched corn, roasted until it pops, is carried in a pouch, eaten by the handful, filling the hollow as best it can. Water is a worry all its own. You learn to ration every swallow, to sip slow, to save even the last drop for when the thirst cuts deepest. Sometimes a canteen is filled at dawn and gone before noon, the memory of cool water sharper than the taste. Coffee is boiled thick and black at camp, the ground swirling in the bottom of a tin cup, but you drink it anyway because it's warm and strong and helps you pretend you aren't tired or hungry. Hardtack is the trail's old joke flour, water and a little salt baked until it's hard as a stone. It's meant to last, and it does, sometimes long enough to outlive the appetite for it. You break it against a rock, soak it in coffee or whiskey, chew slow and careful to save your teeth. On some days, it's all you have, and you learn to be grateful for the crunch, for the way it fills the empty, for the way it keeps you going. Children on the trail learn the language of longing early. They eye the adults' pockets for treats, beg for a twist of rock candy or a lemon drop saved from the last town. Sometimes a mother unwraps a piece of molasses candy, sticky and dark, and breaks it into pieces to share around the fire. The taste is a sweetness that stays with you, long after the sugar is gone. Children trade for treats marbles for a nut, a song for a bite of dried apple, a story for a single peanut. Every snack is bartered, every bite is remembered. Meals are made when the wagon stops, when the sun dips low and the horses need rest. Fires are built from whatever wood can be found, twigs, fence posts, buffalo chips. A pot is hung, beans and salt pork set to boil, the smell drifting out across the camp. If there's time, biscuits are baked in a Dutch oven, the crust browned by coals, the inside soft if you're lucky, hard if you aren't. If the day has been kind, there might be a slab of bacon to fry, the fat sizzling loud enough to draw every nose in camp. But most nights, supper is what you carried. Jerky, hardtack, maybe a bit of cheese or a boiled egg, a handful of nuts. You eat slow, making every bite count, scraping the last crumbs from the bottom of the tin. Around the fire, stories are told of places left behind, of towns ahead, of the best meal you ever had and the treat you still dream of. Someone pulls out a bottle of sarsaparilla, sweet and fizzy, passed from hand to hand, a taste of celebration in the middle of nowhere. The trail is a map of hunger and hope. Every mile is marked by what you eat, by what you save for later, by what you share with others. Food is a kind of currency. A bit of jerky traded for a favour, a biscuit swapped for a story, a piece of candy given to a crying child to buy a little piece. On the hardest days, when the dust is thick and the sun won't quit, a single sweet can feel like a promise, a reason to keep walking. Danger is always near. You worry about storms, about rivers running high, about the threat of outlaws or the quiet menace of hunger that creeps in when rations run low. Food becomes a way to measure safety. If you have enough, you can keep going. If you don't, every mile is a question. Sometimes the trail is littered with what's been left behind, broken wagons, empty barrels, a crust of bread nibbled by mice, a handful of beans spilled in the grass. You learn not to waste, to pick up what you can, to make do with less. Every so often a peddler appears on the horizon, his wagon rattling with tins and jars, candies from distant places, lemons wrapped in cloth, ginger snaps in a battered box. The camp gathers, coins are counted, and for a night the trail feels like a fair. Children laugh, adults trade stories and goods, and everyone forgets, just for a little while, how far they have left to go. The taste of a new sweet, the crunch of a fresh biscuit, the fizz of sarsaparilla on your tongue. These are the moments that linger, long after the peddler moves on. There are seasons to the trail just as there are to hunger. Spring brings hope and green grass, and sometimes wild onions or berries found at the edge of a stream. Summer is dust and heat, the world narrowing to what you can carry and what you can keep from spoiling. Autumn brings the ache of distance and the fear of early frost, every meal a reminder to save for leaner days. Winter is the hardest, the cold biting through every layer, the nights long and the food always running out too soon. You are never alone, not really. The trail is crowded with ghosts, the memory of those who walked before, the voices of those who will come after. You share what you have, not just because it's kind, but because it's necessary. A handful of nuts passed to a stranger, a piece of dried fruit given to a child, a cup of coffee poured for a friend. These are the bonds that hold you together, that turn a line of wagons into a community. At night, as the fire burns low and the stars crowd close, you think about the meals you've had and the ones you still dream of. The taste of fresh bread, the smell of coffee, the sweetness of a single piece of candy. You remember home, the kitchen warm and bright, the table crowded with food and laughter. Out here, every meal is smaller, every treat more precious, but the memory fills you up, carries you forward, gives you the strength to face another day. Sometimes, in the dark, you reach for the last bite of something sweet, saved all day just for this moment. You eat slow, letting the taste linger, letting it remind you that the world is still full of small, stubborn joys. The trail is long, the hunger is real, but as long as there's a bite to share, a story to tell, and hope for something sweet at the end of the day, you keep moving. The trail is enough. It has dust and danger and hunger and fleeting joys. It has the rhythm of boots on earth, the turning of seasons, and the quiet pride of surviving another day. You wouldn't find much coin out here, not unless you were the storekeeper or the banker, and even then most of what passed for wealth was scribbled into a ledger or remembered in the back of someone's mind. For most folks, snacks and sweets weren't just a luxury, they were currency, comfort, apology, hope and celebration, all wrapped in paper or tucked into a pocket. On the frontier, the economy was more flavour than finance. The general store had its ledger, but so did every kitchen, every wagon, every child's hand. A penny for a lemon drop, a nickel for a bottle of sarsaparilla, a favour for a slice of pie. Most days you traded what you had for what you wanted, and what you wanted was often something you could eat right now or later, when the long hours crept by and the road seemed endless. Barter was the first language you learned. A basket of eggs for a handful of licorice, a bag of beans for a tin of fudge, a wild rabbit for a jar of molasses. Some things had fixed value. Sugar was always dear, coffee was gold, and anything sweet was measured not just by weight, but by longing. A mother might swap her last scoop of lard for a bit of rock candy to keep a child quiet through a feverish night. A cowboy might trade half his supper for a single cookie, just to taste home again. Credit was trust, written in chalk on a slate behind the counter, or in the quiet understanding between neighbours. You could buy a bag of crackers and promise to pay when the next crop came in, or take a jar of pickles on good faith and settle up after the cattle sold. Sometimes debts were paid in work, a week of fence mending for a sack of dried apples, a day spent hauling water for a cup of honey candy at Christmas. The storekeeper kept track of every bite that left the shelf, and every promise made in return. Children lived in a world of barter all their own. They traded marbles for walnuts, buttons for sticks of gum, stories for the last peanut in the sack. A single lemon drop could buy a secret, a dare, or a place in a game. The rare child with a whole bag of candy became a king for a day, bestowing favours, making alliances, choosing sides. Sometimes the best trades happened in secret under the schoolhouse steps, behind the rain barrel, in the cool dark of the barn. Snacks were more than treats. They marked the moments when people came together or drifted apart. A pie left on a porch was an apology or a thank you. A jar of hard candy pressed into a neighbour's hand was comfort after loss, or a quiet promise of better days ahead. At barn dances and church socials, plates of cookies and bowls of popcorn were passed from hand to hand, each bite a little bridge across the gap of loneliness or worry. Some snacks were saved for special debts. The preacher's wife might bake a cake for the midwife who sat up all night with her. Or a family might pool their last coins to buy a pail of lemonade for the teacher who taught their children to read. At Christmas, the storekeeper sometimes forgave small debts, tucking a stick of peppermint into a child's hand and saying, "Let's call it even." These small mercies made the world feel a little less harsh, a little more like home. Barter wasn't always fair, but it was always honest. Everyone knew who owed what and to whom. Stories travelled alongside snacks, who had the best cookies, whose fudge was crumbly, who watered down the lemonade, who slipped a few extra nuts into the sack. Trust was as important as sugar, and a broken promise was harder to swallow than burnt molasses. If you were caught cheating, it wasn't just a loss of goods, it was a loss of standing, a kind of social exile that could last longer than any winter. Sometimes the barter extended beyond food. A batch of popcorn might buy a tune on the piano, a tin of ginger snaps might pay for a mended fence, a pie could settle an old argument or win a new friend. On the edge of town, where the world faded into prairie, you learned to measure worth by what you could share, not just by what you could keep. Credit was a risk, but it was also a lifeline. When times were hard, when the crops failed or the herd scattered, the storekeeper's ledger filled with promises, beans, bacon, flour, and always a few lines for candy or lemon drops. Some debts were never paid in full, but nobody went hungry if it could be helped. The community understood that a sweet now might mean a favour later, and a little kindness could carry everyone a long way. Favours and food went hand in hand. A neighbour who helped mend your roof might be thanked with a fresh loaf of bread. The woman who watched your children was paid in apple tarts or a slice of cake. The old man who played the fiddle at every dance never lacked for popcorn or gingerbread. A handful of roasted peanuts could buy an afternoon's help in the garden, and a stick of rock candy might coax a story from someone old enough to remember when the town was just a name on a map. Even outsiders found their place in the snack economy. A peddler rolling through with a crate of oranges or a box of licorice found buyers eager to trade not just money, but eggs, preserves, or the promise of next season's honey. A stranger with a new kind of fudge, a different flavour of taffy, could spark a week's worth of talk and trade, everyone eager to taste something new, to pass it along, to remember it when the days grew long and dull. Sometimes bartering was quiet, just a nod, a wrapped sweet slipped into a pocket, a silent agreement that didn't need words. Other times it was loud, part of the fair or the church picnic, a swirl of hands and voices, laughter and bargaining, as cookies and cakes and popcorn changed hands a dozen times before the day was done. Children learned these lessons early. They watched their parents trade beans for sugar, saw how a pie could settle a quarrel, learned that the world was built as much on favours as on flour. They practised with marbles and nuts, with secrets and dares, with the slow, patient art of saving a sweet for the right moment, the moment when it could buy not just pleasure, but belonging. The snack economy was a web, delicate and strong. It held the town together, caught every debt and every kindness, marked the seasons with sweetness and salt. It was how you knew you belonged, by who saved you the last piece of fudge, who remembered your favourite candy, who forgave your debt when your luck ran out. It made the world feel smaller, kinder, and more hopeful, even when the cupboards were bare. Sometimes the snack economy was all that stood between you and despair. When the crops failed and money ran out, when the herd was lost or the wagon broke down, you could still find comfort in a shared cookie, a cup of lemonade, a handful of nuts passed around a tired table. You could still trade stories and songs, laughter and hope, and for a little while forget how hard the world could be. The town was small, but it was enough. It had gossip and favours and hunger and fleeting joys. It had the rhythm of boots on dust, the turning of seasons, and the quiet pride of surviving together. Sometimes you dreamed of tasting the world's great sweets, but most days you just hoped the last lemon drop would last until the next harvest. And so you endured. You traded, you bartered, you hoped. You saved the last piece of candy for a rainy day, and you learned that sometimes a taste of sweetness was the best promise you could make. Drought comes quietly at first. You don't really notice it until your boots raise more dust than usual, or the horses start pawing at the dry earth, looking for a patch that still holds a little coolness. You might hear someone mutter about the lack of rain down at the general store, or see neighbours squinting up at the sky, hats shading their eyes as if a glare could coax the clouds to finally open. But soon, everyone knows, the grass, once stubborn and green, turns brittle and gold. The creek that ran behind the house shrinks, then disappears, the bed cracked and white, the last frogs buried deep in mud. The garden is the first to surrender. Beans wither on the vine, corn shrivels before it has a chance to sweeten, and the squash, which once sprawled wild and generous, clings close to the ground, its leaves grey with dust. Out here, hunger is never far away. Even in the best of times, you think about food, how much is left, how far it must stretch, what can be traded, and what can be tucked away for a harder day. But in drought, food isn't just a worry, it's the shape of every day. You learn to measure time by how thin the stew has gotten, by how many biscuits are left in the tin, by the sound of your own stomach echoing in the morning. You get creative, you have to. The pantry, already a place of compromise, becomes a test of memory and invention. You scrape the last of the lard from the bottom of the crock, boil beans until they dissolve, grind the toughest corn into meal and hope it cooks up soft. Every meal is thinner, every portion smaller, every treat a negotiation with what you'll have tomorrow. Sweets, always rare, become something you remember more than something you taste. You might find a jar of molasses at the very back of a shelf, the syrup crystallized and sticky, or a handful of dried apples forgotten in a sack. These are treasures, and you dole them out with reverence. A spoonful of syrup in the bottom of a mug, a sliver of fruit for a child's lunch, a pinch of sugar saved for a birthday that might come and go with nothing more than a song. Children learn early to lower their voices when they ask for something sweet. The answer is almost always not today, but sometimes, on the hardest days, a mother might pull a bit of honeycomb from a jar, or a grandfather might remember a recipe for candy made from just water and burnt sugar, pulled and twisted until it cools into something hard and sharp, a taste of hope you can roll on your tongue. You make do. Old bread is fried in bacon grease if you have it, or just browned in a dry pan and sprinkled with salt if you don't. Cornbread is stretched with water and whatever fat you can spare. Sometimes, just for comfort, someone will bake a batch of lard cakes flour, water, maybe a pinch of salt, fried until crisp and almost like a treat. When the drought drags on, you start to see changes in the town. The general store shelves grow bare. The candy jars, once bright with lemon drops and licorice, stand mostly empty. The last sweets bought up weeks ago by those who could afford them. The bins of beans and flour dwindle. The rare delivery wagon brings only what's needed, and even that is rationed. The shopkeeper's pencil working harder than his voice as he marks each family's share. Neighbours become quieter. Gossip fades, replaced by the dull talk of weather and wishes. People trade what they have for what they need. Eggs for flour, a bit of butter for a scoop of sugar, a promise to help mend a fence for a jar of jam. Every transaction is careful, every favour remembered. You don't ask for more than you need, and when you have a little extra, you share it without ceremony. A slice of apple, a homemade cracker, a cup of weak coffee poured from the last of the grounds. At the edge of town, gardens are left to wither. The chickens stop laying, the cow gives less milk, and the children grow quieter, learning to make games out of nothing, to hunt for wild onions or dandelion greens along the fence line. Sometimes a lucky child finds a patch of wild berries that have survived in the shade tiny tart but bursting with taste. These are gathered by the handful, eaten with dirty fingers, the juice-staining lips and tongues, a memory that lingers long after the hunger returns. In hard times, every scrap is precious. You boil bones for days, making broth that grows thinner and paler but is still better than nothing. You scrape the last of the jelly from the bottom of a jar, add water and call it punch. You roast acorns, grind them, and try to bake bread, even though the taste is bitter and the texture is rough. Sometimes a neighbour brings by a dish you've never tried: parched corn, wild greens, a pie made from nothing more than flour, lard and hope. Sometimes the memory of sweets is enough to keep you going. You remember the taste of rock candy, sharp and clear, or the way molasses taffy pulled warm from the pot and stuck to your teeth. You tell stories about fairs and picnics, about the time someone brought a whole basket of oranges, or when a peddler came through with jars of bright penny candy. The children listen, wide-eyed, and the grown-ups smile even as their stomachs grumble. Scarcity becomes its own kind of rhythm. You save every crumb, every crust, every drop of grease. Nothing is wasted. Stale bread is soaked in coffee, fried and eaten as breakfast. The last spoonful of sugar is stirred into a pot of beans to give it a hint of sweetness. The end of a jar of jam is scraped out and mixed with water to make a drink for the youngest child. Sweets become stories, and stories become comfort. Holidays and celebrations don't stop, but they change. A birthday cake is smaller, maybe just a biscuit with a trickle of honey. Christmas candy, once a handful of bright peppermints, might be a single piece, split between siblings. Lemonade is made with more water than lemon, and cookies are thinner, stretched with whatever you can find. But still, you gather, you sing, you share what you have, because even the smallest treat is a kind of defiance, a way of saying that hunger hasn't won. In the worst of times, desperate measures are taken. You grind up old beans, try to make coffee from roasted chicory or corn. You soak bark, boil roots, chew on leather softened in broth. Sometimes, a rat or a squirrel finds its way into the pot, and no one mentions it except in thanks. The shame of hunger is never spoken, only felt in the way neighbours look away, or in the quiet pride of making something, anything out of almost nothing. The body changes in scarcity. You notice your clothes hanging looser, your energy waning, your thoughts turning more often to meals you once had. Children's faces grow thinner, eyes look larger. You learn to sleep through hunger pains, to find warmth in the smallest fire, to savour every bite, no matter how strange or meagre. But even in drought, there are moments of kindness. Someone brings you a biscuit, still warm from their oven. A child finds a wild honeycomb and shares a taste with every neighbour. The preacher's wife bakes a cake for the sick, using the last of her sugar. These are not just acts of charity, but of resistance. Refusal to let want steal every sweetness from the world. When the rains finally do come, it's almost a surprise. The first drops raise the scent of dust and hope. You watch the ground soften, the grass return, the creek fill. The pantry is still bare, but spirits rise. You plant again, wait, and dream of what the garden might yield. The first wild greens, the first new eggs from a hen, the first apples to ripen on the tree, each one is celebrated, savoured, remembered. You never forget the taste of scarcity, though. It lingers in the way you save every crust, in the stories you tell about the time when a piece of candy was worth more than gold. It lives in the way you look out for your neighbours, in the way you teach your children to share, to stretch, to savour. Hunger teaches you not just how to survive, but how to find sweetness even in the hardest seasons. The West is a place of hard lessons and quiet victories. Survival is not glory, it is patience, resourcefulness, and the small, stubborn hope that tomorrow might taste a little better. And when you gather at the table, however humble it may be, you remember, every treat is a story, every story a kind of sweetness, and every small act of sharing is what makes hunger endurable. So you endure, you share what you have, you dream of better years, and you find comfort where you can in a crust, a memory, or the last bite of something sweet. The drought will pass, the shelves will fill, the laughter will return to Main Street, and when the world is generous again, you'll remember the taste of hunger. You wouldn't call it a sweet tooth, not out here. It was more like a wish that never quite left you alone, a hunger that started in your gums and settled behind your eyes, a longing that made itself known every time you walked past the general store or watched a peddler's wagon rumble into town. For children on the frontier, craving something sweet wasn't just about taste. It was about hope, about the delicious possibility that the world might just once give you more than you expected. Most days you didn't ask. You learned early that the answer to "can I have a candy" was almost always not today. Sugar was precious. Molasses, if you had it, was measured in careful spoonfuls, and honey was a treasure hoarded by both bees and mothers. But children are patient in their own way. They watched the shelves, counted the coins, and learned to wait for the rare moments when sweetness became possible. You knew the landscape of every treat in town. The general store's glass jars cloudy at the corners, polished with the nose prints of generations-held lemon drops, horehound sticks, jawbreakers, licorice twists, and sometimes, if the railroad had been generous, a box of peppermint sticks that looked too bright to be real. The shopkeeper watched with a half-smile as children pressed their hands to the glass, counting and recounting their pennies, bargaining for a little more or begging for just one. Sometimes, if you were lucky, she'd slip you an extra "don't tell your ma," and you'd tuck it away, saving it for a day when you needed more than beans and bread. School was a world of its own, ruled by the economy of snacks. Lunch pails, if you had one, might hold a biscuit, a slab of cold cornbread, maybe a piece of dried apple or a handful of parched corn. But the real currency was in what could be traded: a piece of rock candy for a story, a slice of dried peach for a dare, a single gumdrop for a promise you might or might not keep. Children learned negotiation at the end of long days, swapping treasures and secrets, hoping to stretch a single sweet into an afternoon of dreams. Some days a peddler would roll in, his wagon creaking with the weight of wonders, new candies from the east, jars of jam, oranges bright as sunrise. Children gathered like birds drawn by the promise of something different, something that tasted of faraway places. Coins were rare, but hope was not. You'd do chores for a week to earn a nickel, carry water until your back ached, or run errands for neighbours just to have a chance at a single lemon drop. You remembered every treat you ever tasted. The sharp, herbal bite of horehound on a winter morning. The way a stick of licorice turned your tongue black and made you feel wild. The fizz of sarsaparilla, the crunch of popcorn balls at a church social, the sticky sweetness of taffy pulled by dozens of hands at a summer dance. Even the memory of sweetness was enough to make you smile through a day of chores, to keep your feet moving when the road was long and the sun was high. At home, treats were made from what you had never what you wanted. Molasses taffy pulled until your arms ached. Honey candy boiled until it cracked. Popcorn stuck together with syrup and patience. Sometimes a mother might surprise you with cookies, rough and sweet, made from whatever was left in the barrel, or a cake baked for a birthday, each crumb divided with care and eaten slow. These moments were rare, but they lasted longer than any meal, retold in stories and remembered in dreams. On the trail, sweetness was both a luxury and a comfort. Cowboys kept rock candy in their saddlebags, a talisman against the endless salt and dust. Children carried dried apples or a single gumdrop rationed over miles of road, each bite a victory over the sameness of beans and jerky. When a wagon train stopped for the night, the promise of a treat, however small, was enough to turn the firelight golden, to make the hard ground feel softer for a little while. Scarcity made every sweet more precious. In times of drought, when even bread grew thin and beans had to be stretched, a bit of honey stirred into hot water, or a spoonful of jam scraped from a nearly empty jar, was enough to make you believe in miracles. Children learned not to ask for more than there was, but they also learned to savour what little they received. A single lemon drop could last an afternoon, rolled from cheek to cheek, sucked slow until it vanished, leaving only memory behind. Sometimes the craving for sweetness became a kind of game. Children invented new candies from what they could find. Parched corn roasted until it popped, wild berries picked along the fence line, a bit of snow drizzled with molasses and eaten quick before it melted. They challenged each other to see who could make a single sweet last the longest, who could go the most days without breaking and eating their hidden stash, who could trade a pebble or a feather for a piece of candy no one else had. Church socials, fairs and holidays were the high points of the year, marked by the abundance of treats. Popcorn balls, cookies, lemonade, pies baked with whatever fruit survived the summer. Children ran wild, faces sticky and bright, pockets full of crumbs and dreams. These days were rare, but they gave shape to the year, something to look forward to when the days grew short and the cupboards grew bare. Sometimes the craving for sweetness was more than just hunger. It was a way of pushing back against the hard edges of the world, of claiming a little bit of joy in the middle of routine and worry. A mother might save the last piece of candy for a sick child, or a father might trade his own supper for a single gumdrop, just to see his daughter smile. These small, stubborn acts of love made the world feel a little less harsh, a little more possible. Even in disappointment, children found hope. When the candy jar was empty, when the peddler's wagon rolled away, when the last crumb of cake was gone, you learned to wait, to hope, to believe that sweetness would return. The memory of treats outlasted the treats themselves, a lesson in patience, in longing, in the quiet strength it took to keep hoping for more. As dusk settled over the town, children gathered on porches and stoops, sharing stories and scraps, the taste of sugar lingering on their tongues. The world was still hard, still hungry, but for a moment there was enough. The craving for sweetness was never fully satisfied, but it was enough to keep you moving, enough to turn another ordinary day into something worth remembering. The West was never easy, but its children learned to find delight wherever they could. A lemon drop, a slice of cake, a stolen apple, a memory of taffy pulled beneath the stars. The craving for sweetness was a kind of hope, a way of believing that tomorrow might bring more, and that even in a world built on work and endurance there was room for a little joy. And so you endured. You waited, you hoped, you savoured every scrap. You learned that even the smallest taste of sweetness could make the world feel wide and full of promise, if only for a moment. Out here, where the days were long and the treats were rare, the craving for sweetness was enough to keep you dreaming, enough to remind you that joy like candy was precious and meant to be shared. You wouldn't know just by looking where every flavour came from. Out here, at the edge of the new world and the end of old ones, the West was a patchwork stitched from hunger, longing, necessity, and whatever the last wagon or memory could carry. The land itself was old, but the people moving across it were always new to someone, and so too were the snacks they brought, borrowed or made up as they went along. No single kitchen told the whole story. You'd find fry bread sizzling in a cast-iron pan beside a pot of corn stew, a Mexican tamale steaming in the same fire that roasted prairie chicken, a German woman pulling apple cake from a battered oven, while her neighbour pounded dried berries into pemmican with a stone. The West was a place where nothing stayed pure for long, not the language, not the weather, not even a simple piece of candy. You could taste the world in the smallest treats. Fry bread, golden and hot, had a story older than the wagons that rolled in from the east. It was born from loss and improvisation, when flour and lard arrived in government rations and native cooks turned them into something both new and ancient, a round of dough puffed in hot fat, eaten plain or with honey, sometimes folded around beans or wild berries. It was survival dressed as comfort, a food that remembered both hardship and home. Tamales wrapped tight in corn husks were another kind of inheritance. Mexican hands brought them north, and soon they were found in mining camps and along the cattle trails, sold from baskets to anyone hungry for something warm and spicy. You could trade a tamale for a story or a few coins, eat it with your hands, and for a moment the world felt wider, brighter, more generous than the dust and beans of every day. Even jerky was a fusion. Native hunters dried strips of buffalo and deer, preserving meat with salt, smoke, and sun. Immigrants brought their own ways, spicing, marinating, slicing thinner or thicker, hanging meat from rafters or stringing it over campfires. Cowboys borrowed these tricks, turning whatever they had into something that would last through the next 100 miles. Each bite was different, depending on who made it and what they had to spare. In the general store, the candy jars told another kind of story. Licorice from Europe, horehound from old apothecaries, cinnamon sticks and peppermint drops that reminded some of city shops, others of childhood's half a world away. Children with coins pressed in calloused palms would argue over lemon drops or barley sugar, while the shopkeeper told tales of sweets made from cactus syrup or wild honey, learned from neighbours or travellers just passing through. Immigrant families brought recipes folded into handkerchiefs and stitched into memory. Germans made Kuchen fruit-laden cakes that, in lean times, turned into dried apple bars or hard cookies dunked in coffee. Czech and Polish hands rolled dough for kolaches, filled with whatever fruit the land would yield. Chinese railroad workers boiled sweet rice balls and made brittle from peanuts, sometimes sharing, often adapting, always holding tight to what tasted like home. Native knowledge shaped every table, whether folks admitted it or not. Corn was the backbone ground for Johnny cakes, boiled with beans into succotash, or roasted until sweet and smoky. Wild berries chokecherry, serviceberry, currant were dried, mashed, or mixed with fat and meat to make pemmican, a snack that could last through winter or a week on the trail. Sage, wild onion, prickly pear, and pine nuts all found their way into the pot or the oven, lessons in what the land gave and how to take only enough. Food was always being traded, borrowed, and reimagined. A Swede's rye bread met a Scotsman's oatcake, and together they made something that wasn't quite either. Italian miners brought chestnuts and dried figs, while Irish cooks boiled potatoes for candy, pressing the sweet mash with sugar and cinnamon, rolling it in hands still cracked from work. African-American cooks, free and enslaved, brought recipes for pecan pralines, sweet potato pie, and molasses taffy flavors that, once tasted, became part of the landscape. Sometimes what you called junk food was just what survived. Fried pies, made from whatever fruit was left at the bottom of the barrel, were dusted with sugar if you had it, or cooked with nothing but hope if you didn't. Pinole roasted ground corn mixed with sugar or honey was borrowed from native kitchens, packed into pockets by cowboys, and eaten as a trail snack by anyone who learned its secret. Popcorn, another native gift, popped in bacon grease or lard, was seasoned with salt, sugar, or nothing at all, and passed around at socials, fairs, or quiet nights by the fire. Lemonade stands appeared in towns where citrus was rare as gold, the recipe itself a blend of old world and new lemons and sugar from distant places, water drawn from the nearest well. Sarsaparilla, a drink rooted in native and African traditions, became the West's soft drink bottled and sweetened, promising a taste of something modern, something almost magical. Each new wave of people brought a craving, a technique, a treat. Some things stayed, the taste of honey on fry bread, the clean sharpness of pickled eggs, the brittle crack of rock candy on the tongue. Some things changed. A cookie recipe that started in Vienna ended up in a Dutch oven outside Dodge City, filled with whatever nuts or fruit could be traded or found. A tamale recipe drifted north and west, spiced with what grew close at hand. Children, as always, were the eager ambassadors. They traded sweets with no care for origin licorice for fry bread, a lemon drop for a bite of sesame brittle, a hard biscuit for a slice of fruit Kuchen. They invented new games for old snacks, new words for old flavours, and in their hands food became both memory and invention, a way to belong and to dream. Not every story was easy. Some flavours came from loss a crop that failed, a tradition left behind, a recipe altered because the old ingredients were gone or too dear. Sometimes what you made was what you could. A biscuit flavoured with wild sage because cinnamon was a rumour, a cake made with lard instead of butter, a candy pulled from molasses when cane sugar ran out. But each adaptation was a kind of hope, a refusal to let the world shrink to only beans and bread, a promise that tomorrow's treat might taste a little more like home. At socials and church picnics, the snack table was a map of the world. Fry bread next to ginger cookies, tamales beside pickled eggs, popcorn balls alongside sesame brittle, each dish telling a story about who had arrived, who had stayed, and who had shared a secret or a recipe along the way. For one day at least the world was wide and generous, and the flavours lingered even after the music faded and the last plates were cleared. Evenings, when the wind died down and the lamps glowed, families gathered to share what they had. A story from the old country, a taste from a neighbour's kitchen, a recipe that had travelled farther than any wagon. The world outside might be hard, the cupboard nearly bare, but inside the memory of sweetness and spice was enough to make you believe in another day. The West was never just one thing. It was a slow, stubborn weaving of hunger and hope, of old recipes and new cravings, of survival and celebration. The snacks that made people smile, whether borrowed, traded, invented, or remembered, became part of the landscape, as enduring as the dust and as bright as the memory of something sweet, shared, and savoured at the end of a long day. You wouldn't know it from the dust, from the long stretch of sameness that marked most days. But even out here on the edge of everything, there were times when the world gathered itself up and shimmered. Holidays, picnics, and dances. These were the punctuation marks in the long sentence of survival. They were a promise that, for a little while, the world could be more than work and want, that it could taste sweet, sound like laughter, and feel like something close to abundance. You felt these days coming before you ever saw them. There was an energy in the air, children's voices running ahead of them, mothers checking what was left in the pantry, fathers looking for a shirt without too many patches. The dust seemed to settle. Even the wind felt like it was holding its breath. It didn't take much, a birthday, a holiday, the first good harvest, a church social, or just a Sunday when the preacher stayed a little longer, to turn the town from grey to gold. Preparation began in kitchens and backyards, in the counting of eggs and the scraping of sugar barrels. Mothers and daughters sorted through jars, coaxed the last bit of honey from the comb, and pulled out the hidden stash of dried fruit that had survived winter. If the hens had been generous, there would be cake. If not, there would at least be biscuits, fried bread, or a pie made from whatever fruit had managed to last. Every treat was a kind of triumph, and every crumb was meant to be shared. On the morning of a holiday, the house felt different. There was music in the clatter of pans, excitement in the way bread dough rose, hope in the scent of something sweet drifting through the windows. Children hovered, eyes wide, fingers twitching to sneak a taste. Out back, fathers built tables from planks and barrels. Mothers swept the yard and washed the old tablecloth. Neighbours wandered over to trade news and maybe a pinch of spice or a handful of nuts. Everyone brought what they could. A crock of pickles, a jar of jam, a string of sausages, a pie, a jug of lemonade or cider. Sometimes the celebration was small, a family, a neighbour or two, a meal eaten outside beneath a sky too wide to ever be claimed. Sometimes it was the whole town, a barn dance, a harvest picnic, a church social with tables lined end to end, sagging beneath the weight of every treat and hope that could be conjured. The air was bright with laughter, the sound of fiddles, the stomp of boots on hard earth. For a few hours the world felt bigger, friendlier, softer. The treats themselves were never fancy, but they were made with care and a kind of reverence. There were fried pineapple, peach, or just sweetened beans folded into pastry and fried crisp in bubbling fat. There were cookies shaped by hand, dusted with sugar if you had it, or rolled in cinnamon if luck or a neighbour's kindness allowed. Popcorn balls stuck together with syrup were passed from hand to hand, their stickiness a badge of celebration. Lemonade, cool and sharp, was ladled from a chipped bowl, the tartness chased by the sweetness of rare, precious sugar. Sometimes there was cake, baked in a black iron skillet, the crust browned and the centre soft, sweetened by molasses or the last spoonful of honey. Sometimes there were pies, the crust tough but the filling bright with apples or dried peaches, each slice cut thin and savoured slow. Sundays and holidays meant fudge, if there was milk and sugar or brittle made from peanuts or whatever nuts could be found or traded. On 4th of July, someone might have brought out taffy pulled and stretched by every hand, laughter rising as it cooled and brightened. And always there was bread biscuits fresh from the oven, cornbread gold and crumbly, fry bread warm and soft, smelling of hope and oil and shared hunger. These were the foundation, the comfort, the thing you reached for when everything else had run out. Children ran wild, their pockets filling with crumbs and dreams. They invented games to win the last popcorn ball, dared each other to eat the sourest lemon drop, chased each other between the tables and the fence, always coming back to check the dessert plates for something new. For them, these days were magic, a chance to taste the world as it could be, not as it was. The grown-ups watched, smiling, remembering their own childhoods, letting themselves forget for a little while the tally of debts and chores. Old quarrels were set aside, old stories retold, new ones spun beneath the open sky. Sometimes there were toasts, cider raised, prayers mumbled, blessings asked for the year ahead, the crop, the children, the health of neighbours and the safe return of those gone too far afield. The food was more than food, it was community, memory, a wish made visible. Not everything was sweet. There were sausages, pickles, boiled eggs, slabs of cheese, beans stewed with salt pork and potatoes roasted in the coals. But even these tasted better on a holiday, eaten outside, shared with friends, chased with a bite of something sugary, or the fizz of a bottle of sarsaparilla. The ordinary turned extraordinary for a few shining hours. Sometimes celebration was improvisation. A birthday cake made from hardtack crumbled into milk and sweetened with jam. Lemonade stretched thin, more water than lemon. A pie made from dried apples soaked and stewed. The filling brightened with a pinch of cinnamon or a splash of cider. No one complained. The act of making, of sharing, was enough. Even in lean years, there was always something an egg saved, a handful of berries picked at the edge of the woods, a cookie baked with the last of the sugar, a treat bought on credit and paid for with chores or future favours. Neighbours traded, bartered, gave what they could. The snack table became a map of generosity, a sign that hope and kindness survived, even when the cupboards were nearly bare. The memory of these celebrations lingered long after the last crumb was swept from the table. Children fell asleep with sticky fingers and sweet dreams. Mothers sat up late, trading stories over the last cup of coffee. Fathers leaned back in chairs and watched the stars come out, content for a little while. The world would go back to dust and routine soon enough, but for tonight there was music, laughter, fullness. As night settled in, lanterns were lit, the air cooling even as the songs grew warmer. Someone might pull out a fiddle, someone else clap hands for a dance, and the circle of light and sound would widen, pushing back the darkness for a few more hours. The taste of celebration lingered on lips, on tongues, in the memory of a bite of cake or the fizz of soda, in the sweetness of knowing you were not alone. Because out here, where days ran together and work never seemed to end, these holidays and picnics were more than escape. They were proof that joy could be made from little, that sweetness could be found or conjured or shared, that hope could be baked, boiled, or pulled into taffy and passed around with laughter. The taste of celebration wasn't just sugar, it was belonging, it was memory. It was the quiet kind of pride that came from making do and making merry however you could. The West was hard, but it was not without its feasts. The world was hungry, but it never forgot how to gather, how to laugh, how to find sweetness in company and crumbs. And so, as the lanterns burned low and the last song drifted away, you carried the memory of celebration home, in your pockets, in your stories, and in the small, stubborn hope that tomorrow, or next week, or next season, there would be reason to gather again. The celebration was enough. It had laughter and music and fleeting joys. It had the rhythm of children's feet and the turning of seasons and the quiet pride of surviving together. Sometimes you dreamed of festivals in distant cities, but most days you just hoped the cake would last until morning and that the memory of sweetness would outlast the hunger, just a little while longer. You wouldn't call it quiet, not really. Night on the frontier was always full of sound soft wind over the roof, the creak of timbers, the distant yip of coyotes, the lowing of cattle, the shuffling of boots near the door. But there was a hush that came as the lamps were trimmed and the last chores were done. Main Street faded to shadow. The general store's bell stilled, the laughter from the saloon drifting away on the breeze. The world, for a few hours, belonged to those who waited and those who dreamed. In kitchens and cabins, the day's last light caught on tin plates and half-empty jars. The air was thick with the scent of cooling bread, the ghost of fried dough, the sharp tang of coffee grounds drying in the pot. Children with sticky hands and tired eyes counted their candy, if there was any left, or begged for a single dried apple from the jar on the shelf. Grown-ups scraped the last crumbs from the pan, tucked away the last bit of jerky, poured the dregs of sarsaparilla into chipped mugs and called it a treat. Night was when cravings grew sharpest. The hunger was different than the day's longing, not just for food, but for comfort, for reassurance, for the small sweetness that could make up for all the salt and dust. You might reach for a piece of hard candy tucked in a pocket, or break a biscuit in half to share with a child who couldn't sleep. Sometimes a mother would unwrap a secret stash of lemon drop, a pinch of molasses, a square of brittle saved from the last fair offering it up with the gravity of a blessing. The rituals of nightfall were as steady as sunrise. Boots left by the hearth, shirts folded over chairs, faces washed in cold water, hair brushed and braided. Someone banked the fire, someone shut the shutters, someone whispered a last prayer over the bread box or the pantry shelf. In small houses, the beds were crowded siblings pressed together beneath patch quilts, parents with a child wedged between, the family dog curled up at their feet. Warmth mattered more than comfort, and privacy was a luxury for another world. If you were lucky, the night brought stories. Tales told by lamplight, voices low so as not to wake the baby, hands busy shelling beans or patching socks. Stories about the old country, the first crossing, the biggest snow, the year the grasshoppers came, the time someone found a whole tin of imported toffee and shared it with the town. Every story circled back to food, as if the memory of sweets could make the present hunger easier to bear. Dreams came easy on nights when you were full, harder when you weren't. Hunger slipped into your sleep, turning into visions of tables set with pies and cakes, jars of candy in every window, lemonade cold as creek water on a hot day. Sometimes you woke with your mouth watering, surprised to find only a damp pillow and the sound of a mouse in the walls. Other times you dreamed of the old days, a grandmother's kitchen, a father's laugh, a Sunday when the world seemed bright with sugar and hope. Dreams could carry you farther than the fastest horse, to places where no one was ever hungry and the candy jar never emptied. For the grown, night was a time for inventory and quiet calculation. You counted what was left in the larder, what could be stretched into tomorrow's meal, how many beans or biscuits or bits of dried fruit would last until the next wagon came. You watched your children sleep, lips sticky from the last treat, and wondered if they'd remember these nights as hard or as sweet, as something to endure or something to treasure. Sometimes the craving was not for food but for company. Neighbours gathered on porches, sharing the last of the coffee, passing around a single biscuit or the last few nuts in a bag. They talked about the weather, the price of flour, the arrival of a new peddler, or the rumour that someone up the trail had a new kind of candy. Silence was comfortable here, a sign of belonging, the kind of quiet that said, "We've made it through another day, together." Fear had its own place at night. The west was full of danger's wolves at the edge of the herd, strangers on the road, fires that started with a spark and ended with nothing left but ash. But for most, the biggest fear was want, the empty shelf, the bare table, the gnawing that wouldn't fade. You learned to fight it with ritual, a last sip of coffee, a slice of dried apple, a bit of brittle chewed slow, a song sung soft to a restless child. The world shrank at night. The prairie was just a dark sweep beyond the window, the town no bigger than the glow of its lamps. You could hear every sound, the tick of the clock, the sigh of the wind, the slow breathing of those you loved. In that quiet, you found your own kind of prayer, a hope that tomorrow would bring enough, that the rain would come, that the next wagon would carry sugar and lemons, and maybe, just maybe, a jar of candy you'd never tasted before. And yet in the hush there was comfort. The slow rhythm of breath, the weight of a child's head on your arm, the warmth of bodies close together, the knowledge that you had made it through another day, the taste of a single sweet, the memory of a shared snack, the ritual of saving and savouring, these were the small anchors that kept you steady, even when the world felt too big or too empty. When sleep finally came, it was deep and undemanding. You drifted down into dreams as if they were another country, a place where the cupboards were always full and no one ever went to bed hungry. You dreamed of bright kitchens, of laughter and music, of holidays where every table groaned under the weight of pies and cakes and candied nuts. You dreamed of a world where sweetness was as common as dust, where every day ended with a treat and every night began with a story. You knew, even asleep, that the dreams would fade with the dawn. But for now, they were enough, a taste of hope, a promise that tomorrow might be kinder, a reminder that you could survive on very little, as long as you had a bit of sweetness to carry you through the dark. The night was enough. It had hunger and hope, comfort and fear, the rhythm of breath and the quiet pride of enduring. Sometimes you dreamed of tasting what lay beyond the horizon, but most nights you just hoped there'd be a little sugar left for tomorrow, and that the memory of sweetness would outlast the darkness just a little while longer. You wouldn't notice it all at once. Change didn't come with a parade or a shout. It crept in, quiet as dust beneath the door, the way a cold draught finds the cracks in the wall. At first, it was just a sound, the far-off whistle, lonely and hopeful, echoing across the prairie. The railroad was coming. Not tomorrow, maybe not even this year, but soon enough that folks started talking about it in the same way they talked about rain or next season's harvest, with a mix of hope and worry. You'd grown used to a world where distance was measured by the ache in your feet, where a lemon or an orange was a miracle that might show up once in a season, where candy was a hard-won treasure from a peddler's wagon, or a rare splurge at the general store. Out here the world was big and slow. Food was what you could grow, trade, or stretch. Jerky and dried apples, beans and biscuits, sweets made from whatever you could coax from sugar, honey, or molasses. But the tracks came anyway, gleaming rails laid down by hands from every country, cutting across the land like new horizons. The whistle grew louder, closer, until one day it arrived, and nothing was ever quite the same. Trains brought people, yes, strangers with city shoes and city news, but also boxes and barrels and crates stamped with names you'd never seen. Suddenly the store's shelves changed overnight. Canned peaches from Georgia, sardines from Maine, chocolate from faraway factories, lemon drops and licorice in bright paper wrappers. At first these new foods felt like magic. You'd hear the children's laughter before you saw them, running down Main Street with a nickel clutched in a sweaty palm, hoping to be the first to taste the new candy bars or the tinned pineapple rumoured to be as sweet as sunshine. Even the adults who remembered harder times and leaner cupboards found themselves lingering in the store a little longer, curious about the strange new labels and the promise of distant flavours. Canned goods were a revelation. No more worrying whether the beans would rot in the root cellar or whether the apples would last till spring. Now there were tins of soup, peaches swimming in syrup, even condensed milk that could turn a simple biscuit into something soft and rich. Some folks were suspicious at first. What kind of fruit stayed sweet for months? What did they put in it to make it last? But hunger and curiosity are cousins, and soon enough canned peaches became a taste of summer on a February night, a reminder that the world was getting smaller and a little less hungry. Factory-made treats followed close behind. Chocolate bars, wrapped in foil and paper, arrived on the train in neat boxes, each one stamped with a name you could barely pronounce. For the first time, you could buy a sweet that tasted the same every single time, no surprises, no making do, just the steady, reliable taste of sugar and cocoa and something that felt like progress. Children begged for them, saved for them, shared them crumb by precious crumb. Candy stores sprang up beside the general store, glass cases filled with neat rows of caramels, jawbreakers, gumdrops, and marshmallows, each one a small promise that the world was changing for the better. Not everyone was pleased. Some old-timers grumbled that the world was moving too fast, that there was no character in a candy bar you didn't make yourself, no real joy in opening a tin when you'd once worked so hard for every crumb. They missed the slow rhythm of waiting for the peddler, the pride of pulling taffy by hand, the stories that came with every shared treat. But even they found themselves, some nights, pressing a square of chocolate into a grandchild's hand, watching eyes go wide with wonder. The railroad did more than bring food. It brought possibility, a feeling that you could taste the world without ever leaving home. Citrus from California, oysters from the coast, coffee from places you'd only heard about in stories. For some it was dizzying, for others it was a quiet relief. No more hunger for the same old things. No more fear that the next drought would steal every crumb of sweetness. Now when the rains failed or the garden withered, you could still find something bright on the shelf, something sweet on the tongue. With every new arrival, the West became a little less wild, a little more connected. The taste of scarcity faded, replaced by a new kind of craving, the desire for what was new, what was next, what everyone else had already tried. Some feared that something precious was being lost, the pride of making do, the memory of the first orange of the season, the taste of candy pulled by hand and handed out with ceremony. But the world was changing, and all you could do was change with it, holding on to the old ways where you could, welcoming the new when you must. Even the rituals of sharing changed. Where once a pie at a picnic was a marvel, now it was joined by store-bought cookies, marshmallows roasted over a fire, soda pop chilled in a washtub. Children's birthday parties grew brighter, the dessert table crowded with candies from everywhere, a rainbow of wrappers, a sweetness that no longer felt quite so rare. Sometimes a child would ask for a treat and not know how lucky they were, not understand that their grandmother had once saved a single lemon drop for weeks, had once dreamed of chocolate as something close to impossible. But for all the change, some things didn't fade. There were still nights when the power flickered, when the train was late, when the world shrank down to the size of a kitchen and a single lamp. On those nights you reached for what you knew, a biscuit made from scratch, a pan of cornbread, a piece of fry bread fried golden and sprinkled with sugar. You told stories about the old days, about a time when a single piece of rock candy could make a whole week brighter, when the arrival of a peddler was cause for celebration, when the first orange of spring tasted like a promise kept. The West was changing, but it remembered. In every cupboard there was still a jar of something saved, a sack of beans tucked away, a recipe for taffy written in a careful hand. The candy bars on the shelf were joined by the memory of sweets made in Lean Times popcorn balls, peanut brittle, pies filled with dried fruit and hope. The world grew faster and brighter, but the slow joys lingered. The old snacks tasted sweeter in memory, the new ones a little less magical but still worth savouring. So you lived in both worlds, one hand on the past, one reaching for what came next. You learned to share the new candies, to open tins with gratitude, but also to remember the taste of what you had made, what you had waited for, what you had shared around the fire. And as the trains rolled on and the shelves filled up, you knew that every sweetness old or new was worth remembering, worth sharing, worth dreaming about on quiet nights. The world was changing, but you had enough. Enough memory, enough hope, enough sweetness to carry you from one day to the next. and as the train's whistle faded into the dark, you tasted the future, and it was good. It's quiet now. The last wagon's gone dark, the saloon's piano plays only in memory, and the dust on Main Street has settled for the night. The lanterns have been turned down, and even the crickets seem to pause as if the land itself is ready to rest. You sit by the window, the taste of salt and smoke and something faintly sweet still lingering on your tongue, and you think about what it took to make it through another day. Out here, survival was never a single act. It was a rhythm waking to the pale hush before dawn, stretching what little you had, sharing when you could, holding back when you must. The world was big and empty, but your life was defined by small things. The comfort of a biscuit, the glint of candy in a child's hand, the quiet satisfaction of coffee sipped slow as the sun dipped beyond the prairie. You learned to measure abundance not by what you owned, but by what you remembered. The best treats in Orange in winter, a square of fudge pulled from wax paper, a penny's worth of lemon drops, were less about taste than about the feeling they left behind. Sweetness was a promise that tomorrow might bring something brighter. Salt was a lesson in endurance, learned with every mile and every meal. Scarcity shaped the stories you told. You remembered the dry years, the lean winters, the times when bread was thin and beans were stretched with hope. You remembered the way a neighbour shared a pie at Christmas, or a stranger passed you a hard candy on the trail, no words needed. These were the moments that lived longer than hunger, the gifts that made the world feel wide and possible, even when it shrank to the size of a kitchen table. The West was never easy, but it taught you to find comfort in repetition and pride in endurance. The same routines, baking bread, boiling coffee, saving scraps, hiding away a treat for a day that felt too long, were not just chores, but rituals of survival, small acts of rebellion against the emptiness and the ache. You learned to celebrate what you had, not to mourn what you lacked. There was a kind of peace in knowing what the cupboard would hold, in watching the same hands prepare the same meal by the same fire night after night. You didn't need feast to feel full, you needed company, a story shared over a cup of weak coffee, the laughter of children sticky with molasses, the comfort of a neighbour's quiet presence. These were the flavours that lasted, the ones that filled you up even when the plates were bare. As time wore on, the world changed. Trains brought new foods, cans and candy bars lined the shelves, and the old treats became memory, their taste sweeter for the waiting. But the lessons of scarcity lingered. Even with abundance, you found yourself saving a crust, tucking away a sweet, teaching your children that enough was sometimes the best kind of plenty. You remembered the hard years not with bitterness, but with gratitude for every kindness, every shared meal, every night the fire kept burning. You learned to carry the memory of sweetness, to pass it on in stories and recipes, to believe that a single treat could change the shape of a day. You taught your children to savour, to share, to find hope in the smallest bite. The West was a hard land, but it was also a generous one. It gave you hunger, but also grit. It gave you dust, but also sunrises worth waking for. It taught you to endure, to adapt, to lean into the wind and the silence and the long, slow work of living. It taught you that survival wasn't about what you had, but about how you kept going, how you remembered, how you loved. Now, as night settles in and the world grows quiet, you look back and see not just the hunger, but the abundance, the laughter in lean years, the taste of something sweet when you needed it most, the warmth of company at the end of a hard day. You see the trail behind you, marked not just by hardship, but by small joys and stubborn hope. The prairie is enough. It has dust and hunger and fleeting sweetness. It has the rhythm of footsteps and seasons, the quiet pride of surviving together, the gentle promise that tomorrow will come. Sometimes you dream of more, but most nights you're just grateful for the small comforts, whatever you can hold, whatever you can taste, whatever gets you through the night. So you endure, you share, you savour, you remember. You tell stories of the treats you loved, the days you survived, the sweetness that carried you home. And as the stars come out and the world grows soft, you remind yourself sometimes, a taste of enough is all you ever needed.